Tipping in the industry is completely out of control, and this is a perfect example why. And if you guys haven't yet, I would highly recommend that you go and follow the guy, Chris Claffin, a fantastic example of why tipping has become such a leading end killer in our industry.
United States, tipping has turned into a financial form of emotional blackmail, perpetuated by larger and larger companies that have no business even asking for tips.
So like what's exactly happening over in the States, it's pretty much happening in our industry as well, where big role players, big companies in the industry are asking for clients to pay for tips up front. And of course, that in itself is a massive red flag.
And tipping in 2023 might not be healthy for the economy or society at all. But in order to understand where we are, we got to go back in time to the beginning and origins of tipping in the United States. And it all began in the early 1800s when wealthy Americans traveled to Europe. And it's there that they were introduced to the concept. Tipping originated in Europe as an exchange of money from master to serf, where masters would reward their servants with a little bit of extra coin for doing a good job at their job. And when wealthy Americans on vacation to Europe who observed this returned back to the United States, they brought this tradition of tipping with them as a flex.
Yes, excellent work. Buy yourself something nice, peasant.
When this started in the early 1800s in the United States, it was seen as insulting. It was this thing that rich people did to flex on people lower than them, and it was done in bad taste. Sort of in the same way that rich people today post pictures on social media of them on their private jets, while at the same time lecturing us commoners about climate change. Everybody knows that it's cringe except for them. And it was the same thing with tipping back in the day. But despite its negative connotation, there's a reason that tipping took off in the 1800s. Because in 1863, a major change to the American economy made tipping the perfect loophole for businesses to continue saving on labor and avoid change. Because when the 13th Amendment was passed, millions of former slaves entered a work...
So right there, and this is probably going to be one of the most important parts of this particular episode, is understanding your value. Understanding not only your value to yourself, but understanding your value to the industry as a whole. And us as professional hunters, we've often relied too much on the tip. And this is why we're heading into a massive dilemma, especially with the way our diesel's going, the way our interest rates are going, and the way our economy as a whole are going.
Force, where opportunities were scarce to begin with, and former slave owners and their associates who didn't pay these people during the age of slavery weren't about to start paying them fairly now. So in an effort to quietly continue the practice of slavery, many institutions and businesses hired former slaves with ridiculously low wages plus the opportunity to accept tips. And this practice grew in popularity in the South until pretty soon the entire service industry jumped on the bandwagon as businesses saw an opportunity to normalize extremely low wages for low-level positions with the expectation that the difference in these very low wages would be subsidized by you, the consumer, in the form of tips. And that tradition stuck. It spread. And flash forward a few hundred years.
So right there and then is exactly what I've been saying. A lot of us young PHs out there, or a lot of young PHs out there, heading to the industry based on where they're going to get not only the best quality tips, but the most amount of tips valued. So often we look at these big, massive, huge play and role industry players, massive game farms where they're generating high volumes of clientele, and we base that on how much tips we're going to get at the end of the day. And it's kind of devalued the industry as a whole, because now us as professional hunters, not only are we hired on the skill and the attention to detail and conservation at heart, but we're hired because we are willing to take low coming income for higher volume of tips. Not necessarily balancing it out and saying, no, well, look, I'm a lot more worth to the industry as a whole, and I don't mind getting the lower end of tips. For me, I've always based it on what is my value to the industry instead of what tip can I get at the end of the day. Because number one, you're not always guaranteed a tip. And number two, if you're basing your income on that, It's not always guaranteed. And that is where the risk has come in our industry for young PHs coming through.
Now when we all go out to eat, we all know that our waiter or waitress isn't being paid well by their employer, and it's up to us to make sure that they get to eat. It's up to us as patrons to make sure that financial ends meet for the person who's waiting on our table. So unless you have exceptionally bad service and you actually see...
So there's a perfect example of exactly why this industry and tipping is so skewed. So these people, these clientele that are going to come out to our beautiful country and experience our magnificent wildlife, our cultures, and experience just a whole abundance of what South Africa has to offer, now feel obligated and guilty to cover the little end of your salary by giving you a tip. And for me, that is completely inexcusable. And us as professional hunters, we need to stand together. And this is why these big organizations, and I've often said it in times before, where we pay these fees to guys like FASA and all of these organizations, where they should be fighting for us to earn a higher pay salary, and at the end of the day, not rely so much on the tips. Because ultimately, we need to benefit this industry as best as we possibly can. And by doing that, is not only looking after the professional hunters, but the clientele that come out at the same time.
See somebody spit into your food, you're gonna tip them. And that practice can be traced all the way back to the South in the mid-1800s, where former slave owners tried desperately to cling to free and cheap labor. And in 2023, businesses are still doing this, because the federal minimum wage for restaurant employees nationwide is only $2.13 per hour. Now, some states have passed laws to make this number higher, but many restaurants don't pay.
So there, another great example. Us as professional hunters, we don't have a minimum wage. We all know what our minimum expenses may be, or what our expenses are every single day when we're out in the bush. And we're quite happy to accept that and receive a tip as a cherry on top of the cake.
Pay their staff livable wages. But it's allowed because those wages are supposed to be brought up by tips left by patrons. And we've all been conditioned to pay into this system. And now that it's a habit that's been ingrained for generations, more big businesses are tapping into Americans' tendency to leave tips, asking for tips when there is zero reason to leave one. I personally have been asked to tip for buying a bottle of water from my local sandwich shop. Like, that's the only thing I bought. I bought a bottle of bottled water, the guy reached behind him, handed it to me, and then spun the little iPad around to ask me a couple of questions. Like, what are we doing here? And now that everyone is asking for tips for every service that's rendered in our economy, it's becoming really easy to just not tip anywhere. Because Americans are officially in a state of max tip fatigue. And as more people move away from tipping, it hurts the people who need tips the most. The people waiting tables who are getting paid less than minimum wage by their employer. And the most frustrating thing about all of this is if you refuse to tip in 2023, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're a terrible human being, because tipping feels so shady in so many circumstances. Because unless you can put hard cash into the physical hand of the person who helped you, there's no knowing whether or not that money is actually going to make it to them. If you tip on a digital screen, you have no idea whether or not the business itself is just taking that money for themselves.
But with that being said, it's the outfitters that need to have a hard look at this whole situation and understand that there's two people that are going to get fed up with this whole system and really look back at it and say, well, listen, I'm worth more to the industry, so I deserve a higher pay. And not only that, the clientele coming out here saying, well, I'm spending my hard-earned money with you guys. You guys should be looking after your professional hunters so that our service out in the bush is exceptional. And so it should be, because that is what we are meant to deliver, not as professional hunters, but as conservationists as well. This is probably one of the most important episodes I've ever had to do, and I know I'm going to get a lot of flack for it, and I do understand that, but we need to have a hard look at the industry and saying, is it time for a remodel, a relook at things, and understand that going forward, this is not probably the healthiest way to go forward? Or is it just something that we sweep under the rug, carry on doing what we're doing? There's enough young professional hunters out there that can afford to take a couple of losses every single hunt, and not really have the massive responsibilities that a lot of the older generation do, such as families, motor vehicles, dogs, all that sort of stuff that comes with professional hunting. So let's have a hard look at it. Let's open the discussion, and I'm willing to take on anyone onto the podcast and make sure that we get the most relevant and the most resourceful things out there for us to generate this new belief on. And it's not that I want to point fingers at anybody in the industry, because I think it's a bad habit that's been incorporated over many, many years. But I don't feel it's time that we look back and say that it's poisoned it. But I guess we get to look back and say, what can we do to make it better? Let's not do away with the system as a whole, but let's make it better for future generations to come. And with that being said, that puts conservation at heart once again. If you are, happy hunting. Until then, stay safe, stay blessed, stay humble. We'll catch up with you guys soon. Cheers.